Hi, this is a lecture on perspectives on development, which have emerged in the field of development economics and development studies. What I'd like to do is to summarize and organize various perspectives in this field as a way of understanding how to frame the various issues in development, and also to understand the economy and society, which have implications on understanding development problems and also understanding how we respond in terms of development policies. Necessarily, I won't be able to discuss all the intricacies of the debates and discuss them in depth, but I hope this lecture will stimulate interest in the field so that students can pursue this field and begin to understand it better, because there really are implications on real issues of development, especially in responding to the issues affecting people in various communities, including the environment, and which Pope Francis has often called the existential and geographical peripheries. How will I discuss this topic? What I'll do is basically to divide it into three subtopics or three categories. First, looking at what can be called modernization and economic growth perspectives and their critics. Looking at Marxism, neo-Marxism, and dependency approaches. And then what is sometimes called the counterpoint or eco-development or sustainable development perspectives. But to bookend those discussions, what I'd like to do is first to introduce us to the question of the very concern for and concept of development, and then to end with Pope Francis' own reflections on what is called integral human development and integral ecology, which is really his way of providing a vision for responding to the current pandemic crisis, which have implications not just on the health and the environment of the world, but really on broader questions. Because if there's an invisible virus that's affecting us, there is really also a very visible virus of social inequality that we have to address in the world. So first, the concern for and concept of development. It has been asked, for example, is the concern for development something that is old or new? Where do we locate this kind of interest in the social sciences? And why is it that sometimes the question of development is often located simply in the post-Second World War period? So that when people talk about development studies, they simply talk of this period after the Second World War of decolonization, but also the period of the Cold War. Well, the answer to that question is yes and no, because if you look at the history of the social sciences really emerged during a time of rapid and broad social transformation, the period of the Industrial Revolution. For example, if I ask you, what is the full title of Adam Smith's work in 1776? Well, many of you would probably say The Wealth of Nations. But really, if you look at the full title of the work, the full title is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. So therefore, it's a question about development. How do countries evolve? How do countries transform? What is the meaning of value over time? Look also at the way Marx looked at the transformation of human societies. Didn't he talk about the development and transformation of modes of production? So therefore, isn't that also a development perspective? So why is it that at some point in time it was necessary to begin arguing that there was a need for a specifically development economics or development studies? Well, if I ask you another question, for example, if I ask you, define economics for me, you'd probably go back to Mr. Paul Samuelson, your textbook in basic economics. And really, the definition that you'll give me is a definition from 1935, from Lionel Robbins, which says that economics is the science that studies human behavior as the relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. So therefore, at some point in time, economics or political economy was no longer concerned with rapid and broad social transformation or development. It became concerned with resource allocation. And in fact, with the entry into economics of concepts like equilibrium or marginality, which really are concepts from physics and calculus, you'll notice that at some point economics becomes more concerned with stability, with comparative statics, and begins to be very concerned with very, very small changes or marginalism, which is really the concern in the field of calculus. So at some point, it became necessary to begin arguing that what you needed was a field that began to look back to the experience of rapid social transformation or development. So that's the reason why, at some point in time, after the Second World War, when there were the new nations, countries that had emerged from the war as now politically independent, but still economically backward, there was a need to develop and formulate a new field of development economics or development studies, which was during the period of both decolonization and at the same time also the period of the Cold War, which is why it is often associated with the term Third World. As in, there's a difference between the First World of the Western countries or the Second World of the Eastern countries and the Third World, which was also seen as a kind of third way. Of course, some people thought it in terms of hierarchy, as in first, second, third, or third rate. But from the perspective of the countries which were developing, what was needed was to assert the distinctiveness of their situation, and therefore to develop a field that was appropriate to their conditions. Well, as a way of understanding this field of development economics or development studies more broadly, I'd like to introduce you to a classic work from almost 40 years ago, the work of Albert Hirschman, who tries to set up a typology for understanding the field of development economics. It's actually a 2x2 matrix. On the x-axis, now you have what is known as the mono-economics claim, and on the y-axis, you have a mutual benefits claim. But before I talk about that, let me just tell you a joke. No? It has often been asked, why are political scientists so fond of 2x2 matrices, which is what I'll be introducing to you, and of course, I'm a political scientist. Well, the answer is that political scientists can only understand 2x2 matrices, nothing more. Well, to go back to this matrix. Well, if you look at this matrix, it's really a continuum to try to understand the various claims in the field of the social sciences. One is the mono-economics claim, which is an argument, if you accept it, that there is a universality in the field of economics. And therefore, there's only one kind of economics. On the other side is the argument that what you need is a distinctive field, because there may be situations where you need a different kind of perspective. So that is the acceptance and the rejection of the mono-economics claim. On the y-axis, what you have is the mutual benefits claim. The claim that relations can be organized so that they can be organized in a way that benefits those who participate in the relationship via certain kinds of institutions, including the market and the state. So therefore, you would have perspectives that accept the mutuality of benefits, that there can be mutually beneficial relations, or it can be for the good of these different actors, or those who reject it and would say that fundamentally there are differences and therefore they won't provide benefits for those involved in this relationship. Now, development economics as a field, Hirschman says, could be located on the upper left quadrant, which means that on one level, it rejects the mono-economics claim, and therefore it says that you need a separate development economics or development studies. But then on the continuum, you might say that it sees the possibility also of reordering relationships through the state or the market so that it could provide for mutuality of benefits. Of course, this is a continuum, and therefore it varies in degree to which they also accept mutuality of benefits. Now, those who accept both mono-economics and mutual benefits are often those who are associated with classical economics or neoclassical economics. Or we can say later on that this is also associated with modernization theory. Now, on the bottom part of the y-axis, you would have those who reject both the mono-economics claim, and also the mutual benefits claim. And that's where you will find the neo-Marxist or dependency approaches, which we will be looking at later. Now, Hirschman puts the question of Marx himself, or classical Marxism, in the bottom right part of the quadrant, but puts a question mark, because on one hand, we know that Marxists believe that there is inequality in economic relationships. But at the same time, there is a question whether he also believes in the universality of economic theory. In other words, that countries also pass through the same stages in the development and transformation of modes of production. And even if they're brutal in the process, is it also brutal but at the same time progressive from a materialist sense? So anyway, so that's just to begin to understand this field in a typological sense. But we will discuss the details of this as we proceed with the lecture. We'll start with modernization and economic growth perspectives and those who have criticized this kind of perspective. Now, as I said, the historical context in the field of development studies was decolonization and the Cold War. And that's why there was an interest in the new nations. And at the same time, there was an argument that they needed to present the experiences of the West as a model for countries that will be in the process of development. So on one hand, they were already politically independent, but they were economically backward. And that's why the West tried to present this as alternative models of development, which was coming from their own history. So that's why, because the context was the Cold War, the effort to try to propose these perspectives also had the tinge of anti-communism. And that's why sometimes even the notion of the third world is seen as something that was supportive of the first. Although, of course, it can also be argued that those who were coming from much more socialist backgrounds and therefore associated with the Soviet Union or China could be presenting a model of the third world that was anti-West. But anyway, so that was a kind of way to organize the perspectives on development. Now, what they were interested in was to examine the socio-economic conditions that were conducive to the emergence of modernity or the modernization process. The framework in sociology was what is known as the tradition-modernity dichotomy, that there are two stages or categories of societies. One, the traditional societies and the modern societies. And the point of reference for development was the West. So that becoming developed was a process of becoming like the West. So underdevelopment was defined in terms of the observable differences between the modern societies and the traditional societies, or the difference between the West and the third world, or sometimes now called the South. So the task was to try to find what were the barriers to development and how do you overcome these barriers. Now, it's important to also recognize that despite the recognition of barriers, they were quite optimistic about the possibilities for development. So if we were to summarize the arguments of this modernization perspective, they essentially thought of development as a linear process of progression from traditional to modern societies. They did not see a structural and historical connection between the modern and the traditional. You could simply see them as stages in the development process. And therefore, you could not say, for example, that some countries were traditional because of the modern societies. No, they were just following a path that all countries followed. And therefore, underdevelopment was seen as an original state of backwardness. And sometimes this is known also as a dualist framework because it can be seen as dual, not just internationally, but also domestically. And therefore, development was a process of diffusing the characteristics of modern societies into the traditional ones. Now, if you look at what were the things that were emphasized, now what were the things that you had to look for in order to promote development, usually in economics, the emphasis was they lacked savings, they lacked technology, and therefore you should infuse these countries with technology. In sociology, there was a concern with what were the modern values, for example, modern values of achievement, for example, modern values of universalism. And therefore, in the context of the Philippines, you would probably say that they would frown upon things like bahala na or pakikisama, because they were not seen as modern. And in political science, there was a concern that perhaps representative democracy and other participatory processes of democracy were the kinds of characteristics that you needed for development. So therefore, the point of reference was always the West. And as long as you're able to find those characteristics, the process of development could be undertaken. And they usually saw also that in such cases, it was important that government came in because in many ways it was not sufficient for the market to simply just allow this to happen. Now, there were some perspectives within the development economics field, or even the mainstream of development economics, that at some point began to reassess this view of growth. And they were asking the question within the mainstream of development economics itself. No? For example, they were saying that at some point, if you were talking of early development in the 50s and 60s, by the 1970s, people were wondering whether the process of development was not really trickling down to the majority of the population. Was there a need to reassess growth? Was there a need, for example, to try to ask, what is the very meaning of development? Can you simply equate development with gross domestic product, with capital, with savings? And then, of course, if you say GDP is your objective, or growth in GDP is your objective, is this a very good measure of development? What do you really measure with gross domestic product? Aren't you measuring effective demand? But if you're measuring effective demand, isn't this simply the demand of people who already have money? But if the problem to begin with is the problem of lack of money or poverty, aren't you simply ignoring these groups of people? And therefore, not just the meaning of development, but the measure of development becomes very important. And then at some point, there's a question of how do you address this problem of poverty and inequality? So even within the mainstream of development economics, there was a rethinking and reassessment of this process. However, there were those who said it was not enough to try simply to get the government to redistribute income and to promote greater equality through measures like, for example, promoting agricultural development, or through taxation, for example, that would prioritize some of the needs of the poor, and also to, let's say, prioritize, let's say, agricultural development and other sorts of sectors, through certain kinds of policy measures. There were those who were saying that there was something that was fundamentally wrong in the way development was framed. For example, if you simply looked at the history of the third world as a history of following the path of first world countries, isn't there something fundamentally wrong about the appreciation of history there? Wasn't this, in fact, ahistorical? Didn't it consider, for example, that Western countries or the northern countries did not really go through colonialism, but the third world countries or the South went through years of colonialism or neocolonialism, and therefore there was something fundamentally wrong in the historical analysis there. Now, could you also categorize these structures as dual, that have no relationship in time and space? Well, some people were beginning to argue at some point that the emergence of what they called the periphery was really the product of its relations with the center. And therefore, development and underdevelopment were not really structurally separate. You cannot look at them in a dualistic way. And therefore, it was very important to take a much more structural and historical view of underdevelopment and development. And then, of course, if the model of development is one that looked to the West as the goal of development, wasn't this Eurocentric or Western-centric? And therefore, what was needed was a perspective that prioritized the views and the experiences of the third world, or what we call today the South. And then the question is, if you simply tinker with these inequalities and problems of poverty, isn't this really just a very limited approach to development? So at some point, the question was, do you really need something much more transformative? In fact, one of the radical works of the late 1960s said, isn't it a choice between underdevelopment or revolution? And therefore, what you needed was something that was much more fundamental and transformative. At some point, people were asking whether you could confidently be optimistic about the possibilities for development. Because it's true that many countries were not developing at all. And therefore, from a certain perspective, more and more people had become pessimistic about these growth models or these perspectives on development which emphasize the unilinear process of development. Or on the other hand, they would say, if you do not want this continuing underdevelopment, what you really needed was something that was much more liberationist. And therefore, this is the origin of the perspective that what you needed was not development, but liberation. You'll see that, in fact, this word has influenced even theological perspectives, by making an argument that theologies of development were perhaps limited. What you needed was something much more structural and therefore emphasize liberation rather than just development. There is a debate in the development field, particularly in development economics, that looks at the difference between what is called mainstream neoclassical economics and what is sometimes called as structuralist economics or structuralism. And sometimes development economics itself is located in the structuralist perspective. First of all, I think it's important to go back to the schema or the typology that I presented earlier, that you could look at development economics as rejecting the mono-economics claim. And therefore, the model of development as something that was singular or universal. Structuralists would reject this, and say that what is important is to recognize that the experience of the so-called third world countries or the South were historically and structurally distinct from the experiences of the advanced countries. In fact, there is a classic work from 1963 called The Limitations of the Special Case, by Dudley Sears, who became the first director of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. In fact, what he did was to change the norm of what was the general case by saying that contrary to the belief that the general case was the experience of the advanced industrial countries, the general case was in fact the experience of the third world, which were often inflexible economies and economies that were not autonomous of the impact of advanced countries. In fact, one of the quotes from this famous work was this quote: "There is so much for economics graduates to unlearn that unfortunately the abler the student is in absorbing the current doctrine, the more difficult the process of adaptation." Would you believe that? So in fact, it's saying that if economic students simply understood what was being taught in the mainstream of economics, therefore this economics was not useful at all. And his argument was that what you really needed to do was to understand specific cases, or to say that economics was the study of particular economies, because it is there where you understand the specificity of the history and the structure of these countries. Now, it was arguing that precisely because of these structural and historical imbalances, you cannot simply leave the economy and development to market forces. It assumed that you needed state intervention to be able to correct for these imperfections, but not just imperfections, they were really structural imbalances. And therefore, if you did not have enough technology, if you had bottlenecks, for example, in supply, what you needed was really to begin to look at the production process. In fact, the history of economic theory included the multiplier theory of Keynesian economics. But he was saying that you could not expect that there would be a multiplier theory in third world countries precisely because they do not have sufficient supply or do not have the productive capacity to increase supply. So instead of demand leading to an increase in output or income, what you simply get is simply an increase in prices, or if you open the economy, it simply is an increase in imports, which really has a negative effect on these economies.